Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our Curious About live session from Glasgow Science Centre. My name is Laura, and today I am joined by Andy Benson, who is a Senior Education Officer at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Now today, Andy is going to be telling us about how people and bumblebees are more closely linked than you might think. Now, after Andy's presentation, there will be lots of time for questions. So if you have anything at all that you would like to ask, please feel free to submit it into the chat box on YouTube, and we will try and get through as many questions as possible. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Andy for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Laura. Good morning, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning. As Laura says, my name's Andy, and I work for Bumblebee Conservation Trust. So it's my job to tell people how wonderful bumblebees are, and really importantly, to share information about how people and bumblebees are really closely linked and how we really need one another to live and to survive. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share some information about how amazing bumblebees are, some of the fantastic things the bumblebees do, and then talk about how people and bumblebees are linked. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about how we can do something really easy to help bumblebees. So we'll get started. So the bumblebee story starts a really long time ago, actually around 140 million years ago. And this is when the first flowers appeared on Earth. And actually, it might surprise you to know that before there were bees, there were wasps. And wasps are carnivores, which means that they eat other animals. And in fact, wasps normally eat other insects. And they collect other insects and they feed them to their young. Now, about 140 million years ago, when the first flowers came, some wasps realized that instead of getting protein from other insects, they could actually get protein which they need for their young to grow from pollen in flowers. So these wasps thought, okay, I'm going to start taking pollen from flowers instead of catching other insects. And those wasps turned into bees. Now, around 40 million years ago, something was happening around Asia where two huge slabs of the Earth's crust were crashing together and rising upwards, creating a mountain range we now know as the Himalayas. Now, at that time, as the ground started to rise up, the temperatures in that area started to get much colder. And the higher up we go, the colder it gets. And that's why you often see snow on the tops of mountains. But these sort of skinny and bald bees that looked a lot like wasps weren't cut out to survive in these cold places. So they started to get much bigger because that helped them hold on to more of their heat. And then the last thing they did is they got a big fuzzy jacket, and that kept them nice and warm. And around 25 million years ago, that's when we had the first or the earliest form of bumblebees buzzing around the Himalayas. Now, in the time since then, since 25 million years ago, bumblebees have spread out all across the northern part, the top part of our globe. And in fact, the UK is one of the best places for bumblebees. We've got about 10% of all of the world's species of bumblebees here in the UK. We have 24 species out of the world's 250. So I'm going to run through some of the common bumblebee species that we have here in the UK and look out for the different colours of the bumblebees. And particularly, one of the key things we always look for when we're trying to figure out what type of bumblebee we're looking at is the colour of its tail. So here we have the UK's biggest bumblebee. This is the buff-tailed bumblebee, and really common one. And although all of the bumblebees now, or most of the bumblebees now, will be hibernating, the queens will be hibernating, in February and March time, when the bumblebees start to come back out, these buff-tailed bumblebees will be some of the first ones that we see. They're those really big ones that you start to see in the early spring. Another bumblebee is the common bumblebee is the common carder bee, and this bumblebee is all ginger. Not what we usually expect for bumblebees when we think about the black and yellow stripes. This one's completely ginger. Another common bumblebee is the early bumblebee. Again, one of the first bumblebees that we see in the spring, and hence the name the early bumblebee. It's got a tiny little red tail. Some of the names of bumblebees are much easier to remember. This bumblebee has a really white tail, and it's called the white-tailed bumblebee. That's much easier to remember. And then this bumblebee has a red tail, and it's known as the red-tailed bumblebee. Now, this bumblebee in this photograph is doing something really interesting. Sometimes people are a little bit worried about bumblebees, and they think that they might sting them. Now, even though bumblebees can sting you, or at least the female, the lady bumblebees can sting you, the male bumblebees actually don't have stings at all, so they can't sting you. But all of the workers, which are female, and the queen bumblebees do have stings and can sting. They really, really don't want to sting you. And in fact, they'll either fly away, or like this bumblebee is doing when the person's been taking this photograph, they've gotten a little bit too close. So they put their middle leg up in the air and they wave it at you to warn you, to say, hey, stay away from me, you're getting a bit too close. So usually bumblebees really don't want to sting. They'll give you a warning first, and then usually they'll just fly away. This is the garden bumblebee, and again, this is another black and yellow with a white tail, but the garden bumblebee has a really strange claim to fame. The garden bumblebee has the longest tongue of any bumblebee in the UK, and in fact, its tongue reaches the whole length of its body. And bumblebees don't roll their tongues up like butterflies do when they're flying around. They just fold them down underneath their bodies when they're flying around. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. And then this is the tree bumblebee. And this bumblebee is interesting because most bumblebees either nest underground in old mouse or vole nests, holes in the ground. But the tree bumblebee likes to nest in trees, as the name would suggest. And actually, here in the UK, a really, really common place to find tree bumblebees are in bird boxes that people have put up for birds to nest in their gardens. So if you've had a blue tit or a great tit in a bird box in your garden the previous year, often people will find tree bumblebees nesting in their bird boxes. So if you're looking to encourage bees to nest in your garden, putting a bird box up, surprisingly, is a really good way to do that. So we've got lots of different types of bumblebees, but I'm just going to share with you my top 5 facts about bumblebees. So see if you can remember one of these facts, and maybe you take it home and tell somebody else about one of these facts. And I'm going to ask you which is your favorite when I get to the end of them. So the first fact I have for you is that bumblebees use static electricity to help them to gather pollen. As you can see from this bumblebee, it's absolutely covered in pollen. Now, I don't know if you've ever done an experiment where you rub a balloon against your hair and then it sticks to the wall or to the ceiling. And that's because when you rub the balloon against your head, it creates a static charge on the balloon. Now, bumblebees are quite big and their wings are quite small, although they have 4 of them. But they have to flap those wings extremely fast to get them off the ground. So they flap their wings 200 times every single second. So between now and now, a bumblebee would have flapped its wings 200 times. Maybe that's something you can do in your next PE session. See how many times you can flap your wings in 10 seconds. And I bet you won't get anywhere close to a bumblebee. But because they're flapping their wings so fast, they're knocking electrons off of their bodies and they're becoming electrically charged. So when they land on flowers, the pollen sometimes jumps off of the flower and sticks to the fur of the bumblebee, which makes it really, really good at collecting all of that pollen. And I told you that bumblebees first came about in a cold place. So they're very good at keeping warm. And in fact, bumblebees can create their own body heat, which is unusual for an insect. And what they do is those huge muscles they have to flap those wings really quickly. They can vibrate those really, really quickly and create their own body heat. So early in the morning, when other insects need time to warm up, you might see sometimes a butterfly sitting on the ground with its wings open, warming up, getting its body warm enough to fly. A bumblebee doesn't need to do that. It can get up first thing in the morning, get itself warmed up by vibrating those muscles, and get itself up and flying around and collecting pollen and nectar. And I told you about the bumblebees' long tongues. And in fact, bumblebees have got all different lengths of tongues. So some bumblebees have got long tongues, like this garden bumblebee in the photograph. Some bumblebees have short tongues. And that's one of the really amazing things about bumblebees, is the diversity of bumblebees and the way that they're all different, meaning that they visit different flowers. Not all flowers are the same shape. Some flowers are open, and some flowers are long and like a tube or like a bell, like the one in the picture here. That's a foxglove. So the bees with the long tongues can visit the flowers with the long shapes, and the bees with the shorter tongues can visit the open flowers. So that means bumblebees can visit almost every flower in your garden, and that makes them really important for helping those flowers to grow and reproduce, which we'll get onto again in a second. Another amazing way that bumblebees use that vibration of their muscles is sometimes in a flower, the pollen is locked up inside. So just landing on the flower isn't enough to get the pollen out. So the bumblebees can land on those flowers, bite on with their mandibles, with their jaws, and then vibrate those flight muscles. And that unlocks all of the pollen that's locked up inside the flower, and then the pollen will pour out and cover the bumblebee's fur. And bumblebees are really special because they're the only insect here in the UK that's able to do that. So no honeybees or flies or moths or butterflies or any other pollinating insect is able to pollinate some flowers, like this tomato flower here. So when you think about tomatoes, bumblebees are essential for any tomatoes that you like to eat. And we'll talk about food again in a second. Now, this is something a little bit darker for the bumblebees, which we like to think of as happy and fuzzy things. There are 6 bumblebees that we call cuckoo bumblebees. And as you can see in the picture, their wings are a bit darker and their colors are a bit darker. And actually, the way they live their lives is a bit darker as well. So normally, a bumblebee nest will have a queen, which will lay some eggs in the springtime, which then hatch into grubs. She will feed them with pollen and nectar, and they'll grow to become workers. And over time, the queen will make more and more workers. Eventually, when the queen has enough workers, bringing enough food in, she'll start to make new queens and males, and which will then go out. The males and the queens will mate. All of the workers will die off. The males will die off. The old queen dies off, and only the new queen survives. But the cuckoo bumblebees, they don't want to go through all that work. So what they do is, this one here has a red tail. So this cuckoo bumblebee would wait outside another red-tailed bumblebee's nest, wait until the queen has made lots of workers. She'll then go in and she will fight with the queen. She'll chase her off or kill her sometimes, and then she will lay her own eggs in that nest. And then the workers from that nest will actually bring up her babies, and she'll just go away and leave and do none of the work. So she's got to the cuckoo bumblebees have a different way of living their life than the usual social bumblebees. So I've given you 5 bumblebee facts there. Cuckoo bumblebees, the magic tongues that help them feed from all the flowers, using static electricity, something called thermoregulation. That's a complicated word, but that just means that bumblebees can make their own heat. And then buzz pollination. So that's that special thing that bumblebees do on certain flowers that only bumblebees can get the pollen from. So I'm just going to give you like 5 seconds. You've got 5 fingers. Which number was your favorite fact about bumblebees? Was it 1 about cuckoos, 2 about tongues, 3 about static, 4 about thermoregulation or creating your own heat, or was it 5 buzz pollination? Show whoever's in the room with you which number was your favorite fact. Okay, maybe you could pop a comment on YouTube if your teachers get the one that's the most popular. So bumblebees are really amazing, and I hope that you're getting this picture of just how fantastic and diverse and wonderful bumblebees are. And actually, people in the UK have really appreciated bumblebees for a really long time. For such a long time that they haven't always been known as bumblebees. And in fact, a really long time ago, they were called humblebees because of the humming noise that they make as they fly around. And in fact, before that, even before they were known as humblebees, they were called dumbledores, which might be a name that you're familiar with from somewhere else. So bumblebees are incredible insects. They're really amazing, and just in themselves, they are really important just to watch them and to appreciate all that they do in the way that they live their lives. But there's another element to bumblebees. There's another thing about bumblebees that makes them really, really important to us as people. And the key to this is this word, pollination. And pollination might be a word that you've heard before, and it might not be. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about what pollination is, but then more importantly, what it means for us as people. So pollination is when an insect or an animal visits a flower, and it collects pollen from that flower. It then carries the pollen from that flower to another flower of the same type. Okay. When the pollen falls off onto the next flower, that's called pollination. And that allows flowers to reproduce, to make more flowers. Okay. And that's important because while flowers are reproducing, they produce seeds. And seeds around them produce fruits. I wonder how many of you listening have ever eaten an apple. Every single apple that anybody has ever eaten started off life as a single flower on an apple tree. That flower was visited by a pollinating insect, probably a bee, which has carried pollen from another apple flower of the same type. And that it's dropped pollen on that flower, which has allowed that flower to drop its petals off, swell up at the base, and become this juicy apple that we like to eat. And this is true for so many of the fruits and the vegetables that we like to eat. So let's have a look at what would happen to these three fairly normal, fairly typical meals that we all like to eat. So we've got some chips with ketchup, we've got a nice vegetarian pizza there, and we've got some beans on toast. I'm sure all of us at some point have tried at least one of these meals. But if we take away pollination, if we take away the bumblebees, look what happens to these meals. We lose the tomatoes for our ketchup and the vegetable oil to cook our chips in. We lose all the vegetables that go on our pizza, the tomato base. We lose the beans, and we lose the tomato sauce that go with the beans as well. And as you can see, without bumblebees, without pollinators, we still have food, but actually the food that we have is much less interesting and certainly not as good for us as the food with bumblebees and with pollinators. So that is how bumblebees and pollinators are so closely linked to our lives and our health. Okay, 3 times a day, or sometimes more, we have a meal, and all of those meals and lots of the food in those meals relies on bumblebees and other pollinators to make them. So I hope you're getting the sense that bumblebees are incredibly important. They're wonderful, amazing, interesting insects, but they're also so important to us. But unfortunately, bumblebees are really in a lot of trouble. They're not doing great. And the reason for that is because over the last 100 years or so, we've really changed the way that we use our land. And we have pictures like this, which have lots of hedges and trees and flowers in them. Now, remember that bumblebees take pollen and nectar from flowers, and that's the only place that they can find food, from flowers. Okay, a bumblebee's only food comes from flowers. And over the last 100 years, we've changed scenes like this one. We've grown our towns and cities because our population has gotten bigger. We've got more and more people on the planet. So we've had to build more, make our towns and cities bigger, but that's taking away some of our flowers. And we've changed the way that we grow our food. We've got bigger fields because we have bigger tractors and bigger machinery, because we have to feed more people more cheaply. So we've changed the way that we use our land. And the result of that has meant that we have fewer flowers than we ever have had. And in fact, the number is pretty startling. We've lost over 97% of our wildflowers. So that's, if we had 100 flowers 100 years ago, we only have 3 left. And in fact, people think that it's actually fewer than that now. We've lost 97% of our flowers. And flowers, remember, are the only food for bumblebees. Now, that might seem like a gloomy picture, but there's something really, really simple that every single person can do to help bumblebees. And it's as simple as this. The problem for bumblebees at the moment is that they've lost 97% of their food. Their food, remember, is flowers. So what can we do to help bumblebees? We can plant more bumblebee-friendly flowers. And one flower can make all the difference for a bumblebee. When a bumblebee fills up with nectar from a flower, it fills up its stomach, and that's like filling up its fuel tank. And a bumblebee can then fly for about 40 minutes before it needs to fill up again. So if you had one flower in a pot, on a balcony, on a patio, in your school grounds, a bumblebee could land on that flower and refill on its way back to the nest. And if that flower wasn't there, that bumblebee might not make it back to its nest. So even one flower can make a big difference. And if you imagine if every single person in your class planted one flower, then that creates a big difference. Maybe you have 30 flowers then. And if every student in your school planted one flower, that's hundreds of flowers. And if we tell people about how important bumblebees are and the fact that they need bumblebee-friendly flowers in our gardens and parks and schools, then we can make a really big difference to bumblebees. And all those flowers that we lost because we changed the way that we managed our land, we can replace them in our spaces. And where we are in our spaces, we can make a big difference and help bumblebees continue to do the important jobs that they do for us as well. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm really excited to answer some of your questions.
Brilliant, Andy. Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. I feel like I've learned lots and lots from your presentation. I especially enjoyed hearing all of the bumblebee facts. I think the one about the cuckoo bumblebees has probably been my favourite. And it was also really interesting to hear what we can do to help bumblebees, something so simple. So thank you so much for that. So now we are going to move on to our question and answer session. And remember, if you've got any questions that you would like to ask Andy, you can submit them into the chat box on YouTube. And like I said, we will try and get through as many as possible. But for now, I think we're ready for our first question. So we'll get that up on screen now. And it is a great question. Why do bumblebees buzz?
Yeah, that is a great question. And the answer, I think, might not be what people expect it to be. I think people often would presume that the buzzing sound comes from the flapping wings. And like I said in my presentation, bumblebees have to flap their wings 200 times every second to get them off the ground and to fly around. So the wings are moving really, really quickly. But actually, the buzzing sound comes because of the muscles that are moving the wings. So the muscles move up and down and in and out like this, and that causes the wings to move in a sort of circular motion. And it's really amazing, actually. Bumblebees fly more like helicopters. They create lift both when they flap their wings up and when they flap their wings down because of the way they tilt them. But actually, it's the air moving through the thorax, which is the big middle part of the bumblebee, where all those muscles are. It's the air moving through that really quickly as those muscles open and close, a bit like an accordion. It's the air moving through there that's creating that buzzing sound.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's a great explanation. I had no idea that that's how it works. So fantastic. And we'll get our next question up on screen now. And it is, do bumblebees make honey?
I'm really pleased that somebody has asked this question because it's one of the key differences between honeybees and actually all other bees in the UK. In the UK, we've got around 275 different types of bee, and only one of them makes honey like we know it, and that's the honeybee. And the honeybee is what we call as domesticated, so it's looked after by people. So people have hives. Almost all of the honeybees that you ever see, there are a few wild ones, but almost all of them that you see will be owned by a person, looked after by a person to make honey for us to eat. All of the other species of bee, the other 274, are what we call wild bees. Okay, 24 of those are bumblebees, and all of the others are what we call solitary bees. So things like mason bees and leafcutter bees and those sorts of things. And although they collect nectar and they do feed that to their young, they don't store it over the winter. So I mentioned in my presentation that bumblebees and all of the other wild bees, they have something called an annual life cycle. They have the queens, which emerge from hibernation in the springtime. and they create workers and create a colony of up to 400 individuals. And then when they have enough workers bringing in enough food, they create new queens and new males. All of the workers, the males and the old queen, die off, and the new queen will then hibernate over the winter and start the whole thing over again. The reason that honeybees collect honey is because lots of their workers live over the winter when there are no flowers around. So they collect the honey so that they have food to eat over the winter. And because bumblebees don't survive over the winter like that, they don't need honey, so they don't make it. So honeybees make honey, no other bees make honey.
Perfect. And again, something that I didn't know, a great question to get the answer to there. So thank you very much. Okay, we'll get our next question up on screen now. And this one is, if we see a struggling bumblebee, is it true that we should give them sugar water?
Yes, thanks, Amy. Yes, I suppose yes is the answer, is the simple answer. However, our advice usually is if you see a struggling bumblebee, sometimes they're just having a rest. Sometimes they're just waiting around. It might be a new queen that hasn't got herself a nest yet. She might just be waiting till she needs her next feed. So usually what we would advise you do is, if there is a flower nearby, is to pop the bee onto a flower. Certainly if it's sitting in the middle of a pavement or somewhere where it might get squished, put it onto a flower. If there isn't the opportunity to put the bee onto a flower, then absolutely we suggest 50-50 sugar and water on a teaspoon. And it's really important when people do this that they're careful, that they only use a small amount, and they don't put it on a flat surface, because if the bee gets covered in the sugar water, it sticks its wings together and then it's unable to fly. So absolutely sugar water can help bumblebees, but we always say if you can find a flower, then that's even better.
Perfect. Great advice there for helping our bumblebees. So thank you, Amy, for that question. That was fantastic. We'll get our next question up. And the next question is another thing that I really wanted to know. So why are bumblebees black and yellow?
Yeah, okay. So usually markings are for a couple of reasons. So animals of all different types of markings. It can be for camouflage. The markings on something like a zebra or a tiger are for camouflage. But the black and yellow on a bumblebee isn't really great for camouflage. They can be to attract a mate, which could be a reason why bumblebees, particularly as you've hopefully seen from the beginning of the presentation, not all bumblebees are black and yellow. We have some that are black and red, and we have some that are all ginger. We have our great yellow bumblebee, which wasn't on my presentation because it's one of our rare bumblebees, but that's all yellow. So the reason probably that bumblebees are these colors are to warn predators. So animals that might want to eat a bumblebee, they have these bright colors to warn them that they have a sting and that they're dangerous and that they probably shouldn't try to eat them because they might get a sore nose.
Perfect, Andy. Thank you so much. So we are almost out of time for our live session, but just before we finish up, we have got time for one final question. So we'll get that up on screen now. And our final question is, what does a baby bumblebee look like?
Okay. People think a baby bumblebee isn't, again, what you would expect. A baby bumblebee is a grub. So if you imagine the same sort of difference between a caterpillar and a butterfly, exactly the same things happening with a bumblebee baby. So the bumblebee queen will lay an egg, and it will hatch into a little white grub. It looks a little bit like a maggot, but much more beautiful because it's a bumblebee. And it's in a little wax pot, and it's munching away on pollen. And the pollen has that protein that gives it what it needs to grow. And exactly like a caterpillar does, once that little grub gets big enough, it spins a silken cocoon around itself, and it stays in there for a couple of weeks, and then it comes out as an adult bumblebee. And actually, when it first comes out of its cocoon, it's completely white. It's an adult bumblebee, but it's completely white. And it takes a little while for the colors to come into the bumblebee after that as well. And so however much food the baby bumblebee gets, the grub gets, that will make the bumblebee the size it is as an adult for its whole adult life, which if it's a worker bumblebee will be 3 to 6 weeks, or if it's a queen bumblebee, it will be a full year.
Perfect. Andy, thank you so much for all of those answers, and thank you for your presentation this morning. I really enjoyed it, and I know that I learned lots from it, and I'm sure everybody watching did as well. And thank you to everyone for your amazing questions. I have loved finding out the answers to all of them. Now, if you would like to learn more about bumblebees, you can find resources from Andy and the Bumblebee Conservation Trust on our website, which is curiousabout.glasgowsciencecentre.org. On the website, you will find lots of different videos, games, and resources that you can explore and enjoy. And all of our live sessions are being recorded as well, so you'll be able to find those on the website. Now, we would love to hear your thoughts on these live sessions, so we are posting a link to a short survey in the YouTube chat box just now. If you're able to, please do take the time to fill that out and help us to shape these future sessions. But once again, Andy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have loved having you, and thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you have a lovely day, and bye for now.
Thank you.